You recall, we've been going over The Walk, written by Adam Hamilton, subtitled The Five Essential Practices of the Christian Life. And as we went through this, we've already covered the first three topics of worship, study, and serve. And as we continue to explore the Christian walk with Jesus, we turn to the connection between money and our spiritual life. Last week was really on service, which is how we do things for other people. This week is really on giving financially. As we talk about that, I want you to remember that when you read the scriptures in the Bible, Jesus is recorded talking about money more than money and material possessions, more than worship or prayer or scripture combined. That's a lot of content. Adam Hamilton describes this as constantly having a battle between the billfold and the Bible. So he carries one of these in each of his back pockets. So he carries a wallet in one pocket, he carries a small pocket Bible in his other pocket. And what he describes are these two being at constant battle against each other. He also shares a story about the tax return selfie. And so he was meeting with his accountant and they were discussing going over his tax return. And he told Adam that he had been doing some research and he had been looking at tax returns, especially of presidents and vice presidents and presidential candidates. So all of that is public record. And he said he's been doing some research, and doing this for several years, and has come up with what he called the tax return selfie. So he looks at a couple of different things in the tax return selfie. And one of the first things that they look at is your mortgage interest compared to your income. And then the second thing that he looks at is your amount of charitable giving. What he found out is that when he did the research on this and really looked at it, that using those two items together is actually a better predictor than your FICO score and your adjusted gross income when it comes to determining whether you're at high risk for defaulting on loans. We see that those are really people that are living at or above their means that end up having this really high mortgage expense and a very low charitable giving expense. It also could just be that they don't see a lot of value in giving. So it also can be a little bit of an insight into a moral character. But he found out that the greater the margin between your mortgage interest and the amount of giving that you have, the greater risk that you are to the loan, for the loan. So I found this really interesting. And I was like, I want to look and see just where I'm at on these numbers. So I pulled out my tax return from last year, and I found out pretty quickly that with the tax changes that happened over the past couple of years, it's not as easy as it used to be to just pull out these two numbers. Many of us have just taken a standard deduction and are no longer itemizing. So much of this is not readily available. But I've always heard that you can really tell where someone's heart is if you look at two things. One, look at their calendar, and number two, look at their checkbook. So where people spend their time and where people spend their money is where they really find the importance. And you can see a lot to that. So although we might not be able to do the tax return selfie, we can probably do the bank account selfie instead. It's in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And in Luke 12:15, we see him say to them, watch out, be on your guard for all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. It's interesting when you think about this. This is so counter so many things in our society today. Almost all of society is exactly opposite that statement. The society would have you believe that life absolutely revolves around your possessions. How many different things have we seen? You've seen an article that talks about the 10 watches that every guy must own. You go to the grocery store and you can grab the latest car and driver, which has the latest car models with all the bells and features. You see the commercials for the new iPhone. You see ads as you scroll through social media for custom clothes, and you tell us what you like, and our person will custom make you a box of clothes and send it to you. All of these really are designed to promise you the good life. You know, there is a philosophy called hedonism. It's drawn from the Greek word for pleasure, and it's really a philosophy where the highest good is pleasure, and humanity's goal is to maximize pleasure and to minimize pain. Although it often has a different connotation that goes along with it, by that purest definition, many of us in today's world practice hedonism, although we probably wouldn't want to admit it. Right on the heels of that, there's another term called hedonism adaptation. So it's a little bit different, and it is where you really desire something, you think about it, you shop for it, you purchase it, and then very shortly after, it loses all of its allure, and we're on to the next thing. You see, when we make pleasure and the acquisition of more things that are new and better, we make that our primary goal. The pleasure is very short-lived. Now, we believe the book of Ecclesiastes is written by King Solomon, who was probably one of the wealthiest of all the kings. And he starts and says that I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers, a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all of my labor, and this was the reward for all of my toil. But interestingly, as you continue to read Ecclesiastes, what you find is that all of these possessions and this wealth that he had amassed, it didn't provide joy, and it didn't provide lasting pleasure. He later describes it as spending a lot of time just chasing the wind. So if lasting fulfillment and contentment and satisfaction aren't really found in possessions, then where do we find them? Adam talks in his book about 3 keys to the good life. And that was actually Stoic philosophers that described the opposite of hedonism. They wrote about learning to want what you already have. And how do you cultivate that desire? Simply by giving thanks for what you have. See, giving thanks changes the way that you feel about something or someone. Adam says in the book, as you give thanks for what you have, you find contentment and freedom. You possess your possessions rather than your possessions possessing you. You know, we talk about this, you think about this largely around your physical possessions. But as I said, it also works with people. You know, oftentimes we find ourselves focusing and polarizing our thinking, where we look at someone and all we can remember is the bad stuff they do. Or we can look at something and all we can remember is the part of it that doesn't work exactly like we want for it to. Whereas there's usually, most of the time, we spend our time in the middle, not on the extremes. And there's always things that are really great about people or about possessions. Oftentimes we don't focus on those. And just by focusing on the fact that your spouse chose to cook you a special meal, instead of on the fact of whatever it is that they may do that gets on your nerves, it changes the way that you think about that person. It changes the way that you appreciate that person. It's the same way with our possessions. Instead of thinking about how much our phone is horrible and the camera's not good on it, and I would really like to have the new iPhone because I can make these new pictures and I can make better TikTok videos, or whatever it is that you're doing. Most of us can look at the phone we currently have and go, you know what? I'm able to communicate. I can talk to my family. I can be in touch with work if I need to. This phone works just fine. And I'm really glad that I have the opportunity to do a video call with my family that lives miles away on this phone, as opposed to looking at it and considering all of those negative things. So that was the first thing that I talk about, is really giving gratitude. The second key that they talk about is living purposefully. Live a meaningful life that's fulfilling. And as Christians, part of this for us is following Jesus. Being a follower involves caring for others. The meaning is not in things or in possessions, but in loving your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, and all of your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. There was an Austrian neurologist and physicist named Viktor Frankl. Viktor lived during World War II and actually survived 4 Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. All of his family, except for one, perished during this time. But what he noticed as he was living in these camps is he noticed that some of the prisoners would wake up in the morning like they had something to live for. And what he found out by looking at them is that they typically had this attitude that they were going to wake up to serve others. He continued to talk about this and actually wrote a book about this later, and developed the concept of logotherapy, which really just is broken down into its very basic core, means that human beings who have a sense of meaning in their lives deal better with bleak situations. He describes, and Adam describes in the book, that Frankl is on a morning march. They had to get up before dawn, march many miles in the cold to a work site. And as they're walking in the dark and they're stumbling on each other, he's just struggling. And he thought of his wife, and he thought about how much he loved her. And he found his purpose in thinking of her and thinking of the good things and thinking about how much he loved her and how much he wanted to see her again. And at the point, he didn't even know whether his wife was alive or not. And Jesus said, no one has greater love than to give up his life for his friends. It's this type of selfless love that cares for others. And it gives us meaning and hope and life. The third key is generosity. We were made to be generous. And in generosity, we find joy. Collectively, we do this as a church through our tithes and our offerings. You think about some of the impacts that we have had. You think locally when we collect food for White Christmas. Or you can think worldwide when you give to fight against malaria as the United Methodist Church as a whole. Whether it is the blessing box where we can feed the locals, or whether it is the work of the United Methodist Church to support the ministry of people who are doing missionary work, or the lives of those that are oppressed in other countries. Winston Churchill said, "We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give." In Luke 6:38, it says, "Give, and it will be given unto you. A good measure, pressed down, shaking together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." So I want you to think about this. We were created in the image of God, and God is generous. This is most clearly seen on the cross. And when we are being generous, we are walking more closely with God. Adam Hamilton tells a story in the book about Rob Bliss. He's a filmmaker, and he made a film of an experiment. And what he did was he took a bunch of elementary aged children, and this was right around Christmas time. And so he took all these kids and he asked them what they wanted for Christmas. And they made their list, and whether it was, a huge Lego house or, an Xbox or whatever, a bicycle, whatever that may be, had them write it down. And then he asked them, what do you think your parents would want? And so they list off all of these things. My wife, my mom doesn't really have any jewelry. I bet she'd really like to have a bracelet. Or I think they'd like to have some new clothes or a car, or somebody even said a home, just depending on what it is, whatever that situation is. And so he recorded all of those things too. So then the kids actually receive what they wanted for Christmas. So whatever it was that they had on their list, he gave it to them. And you see the typical reactions. They are overjoyed and excited. They're loving their gift. And then he pulls them over and he says, so here's the deal. Here's the catch. You can keep that gift that we just gave you, which is your gift that you wanted. You can keep it. Or we'll take your gift and we will get whatever you thought your parents would want for them. And as you see these kids turn in their gift and give the gift to their parents. And so I asked the kids as they do this, like, well, why do you do this? And they were like, my mom takes care of me. She has sheltered me. She feeds me. She loves me. Another kid said, every single year I see my mom or my dad getting gifts for everybody else, but they never get anything. And I want to be able to do that. Some of them just very simply said, my mom and my dad, they really love me and they just care about me. And I want to be able to do this for them. This type of childlike love and lack of being selfish is just amazing. And if we could have a little bit more of that in our world, how different it would be. One of the other stories that Adam says in the book is that he asked his pastor, his very first pastor, how much he was supposed to give to the church. And the pastor's initial answer, I thought, was just amazing. So I recorded it here, but he said, the offering is an expression of thanks to God. It's an act of worship and sacrifice where you recognize that all of life is a gift from God, and that our offerings both honor God and they make the possible ministry of the church. I thought, what a great answer to how much are we supposed to give? What a fantastic answer. He then taught him about the tithe, which is giving the first 10%. So Adam talks about this again, and as he goes through this, he shares that the first year that him and his wife were married, they actually lived below the poverty line. So they were still in school, trying to make ends meet. Even living below the poverty line, they made the decision that they were going to tithe. And he actually made the decision after speaking with his pastor. He said, he describes, I'm very young, teenager. I'm working at the little grocery store. My check is, maybe $70 a week or something like that. And I'm supposed to give 10% of that to the church. And he said, you know what? If I'm really going to be a follower of Jesus, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. And he started giving 10% to the church. And since then, he's given more, but he never dropped below 10%. Even when he and his wife were living below the poverty level, they never dropped below 10%. His thought on this, and seen it in a couple of different places, is that if you wait to give what's left, you'll never make it. You'll never give 10%. There's always something else. And I would go way back to the very first of this lesson. What you spend your money on is really reflective of that. That's why we often call the tithe the first 10%. It's on the top. The very, very first thing, give 10%. You know, as we went through this series, there's been a constant theme that Adam likes to talk about the right fist and then the left fingers. And so the right fist in this lesson is the work we do as a church through your tithes and through your offerings. Some of those things that we talked about earlier. The left fingers, on the other hand, are that he wants us to practice 5 acts of extraordinary generosity a month. 5 acts, extraordinary generosity. Here's the deal. Your definition of extraordinary generosity is going to be very dependent upon you. It may be giving extra money above and beyond to the church or to local ministries. It could be sponsoring, another child, or it could just be paying it forward in the drive-thru, or taking care of someone's lunch. Your definition of extraordinary acts of generosity is really dependent upon your own situation. So when you think of extraordinary acts of generosity, there's a lot of things that can be included in that. But the key point here is we want you to do something where you're giving above what you normally do 5 times a month. As we come to the end of this lesson, I want to share with you the video. So Adam Hamilton does a really good job in his videos of being able to break this down. And if you recall, this was a Lenten series. We went way past Easter on this series, thanks to COVID-19. But as we have went through this, there's always a piece of this that ties this back to the last words of Jesus Christ from the cross. And so this is a clip of that last week, because we're talking about our 4th week here. And so we watched a big portion of this video, but I want to pick back up where we left off last week and let him tell you about how the last words from the cross really tie in with giving for him.
Giving, and of course our giving is in response to God's giving. God's given us everything. Everything I have is because of God. The very air that I breathe, the fact that I'm still alive, the time that I have, whatever influence I have, whatever financial resources I have, because God somehow gave the capacity for me to be able to earn a living and do what I do. And so it all belongs to God. Not just 10%, everything is God's. And I think about, the highest act of giving is to lay down ourselves for God, right? Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their life for a friend. John 3:16, which everybody has memorized, God so loved the world that he did what? He gave. Right, he gave his only begotten son. Right, this is the nature of God, is to give. And if we're going to walk with God, that has to be our nature. And this is what we see in Jesus. He's laying down his life, he's giving himself for us. So Jesus speaks about this, and talking about, I came to, seek and to save those who are lost. Even from the cross, he's trying to do that in his self-giving. But the place where I hear that in the 7 last words of Jesus, or statements of Jesus, is when he says, I thirst. Now, John says this, I thirst, and it just seems like a sort of commonplace thing to say. Like, why is that included among the 7 last words of Jesus? Except it's John. And everything John says that seems to be commonplace has some deeper meaning. So anytime you find some odd detail, it probably means something. So when Jesus says, I thirst in John's gospel, John intends for you to remember that earlier in the gospel, Jesus goes and meets a woman at a well, a Samaritan woman who'd been married and divorced 5 times and was now living with a man. And he says to her, give me a drink. And she says, are you, a Jewish man, a rabbi, asking me a drink of water from this well? And he says, this woman, if you knew who you were talking to, you would ask of me and I would give you living water and you'd never thirst again. And we're meant to see here that in this moment, the source of living water has run dry. He's poured himself completely out for us so that we might have living water. He's given everything he's got. He has given everything he's got. Now,
as we hear that video and we listen to that clip, I'm reminded that this was a Lenten study. And ideally, we would be hearing this just a few weeks before Jesus was crucified. And heard this story many, many times, and often have thought, I thirst. Pretty commonplace. I'm in the healthcare field. Unfortunately, I have been with people who were dying, and oftentimes, especially when they are dying of dehydration and shock, they will be thirsty. So I've always sort of taken it and brushed it off of I thirst. It's a human reaction. It just showed a part of the human experience that Jesus was going through on the cross. Adam describes that deeper meaning today, and about how Jesus Christ, who was giving everything for the world, was now empty. That living water had been poured out for the entire world, and the one who was the living water is now thirsty because he emptied himself on the cross for all of us. It was a really impactful thought for me to have. And that's why I like to just let Adam do some of these video clips at the end. This brings this lesson to a close. We do have one more week. I hope that you come back next week. So the first week of this series was probably the most powerful to me. Interesting, this last week is my favorite. And so I hope you come back next week for Share. That's the fifth principle. That's the one we'll talk about next week. So I want to close and ask you to join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, I just come to you today. I'm so thankful for this time that we have together. I'm thankful for the technology. I'm thankful for just the ability for us to be able to connect and continue to share in your word and grow even through these times that we have now. Lord, I thank you so much. I thank you that we're made in your image, and I thank you that you are the definition of generosity. We see you giving from the very beginning to the very end, and giving your son as to pay the ransom for all of us, and for all of our sins. Lord, I just thank you for that. Lord, there's going to be times that we miss the mark. There's going to be times that the battle between the wallet and the Bible, the wallet's going to win. Lord, I just pray that you would help us see the needs of other people, that those of us that have been blessed, you would drive us to give and to give generously, that we would be able to really embrace Jesus's words of it's not all about the possessions. It's about love, and it's about loving our God and worshiping you, and it's about loving other people. Lord, help us to use the gifts that we have financially to help other people. Help us to be better givers. Help us to be more like you, who gave everything for us. It's in your Son, Jesus Christ's name, that I pray.